So in my last audio, I said that I was going to discuss three ideas, and I only got to the first idea. So the first idea, if you will remember, is that thinkers are actually doers who are simply so narcissistic that they do not acknowledge that the world does not revolve around them. So the difference between thinkers and doers is not a fundamental characterological difference. It is simply that thinkers are so intensely narcissistic that instead of engaging the world on its own terms, they prefer to engage it through the medium, the mediation, the insulation of various symbolic and purely logical operations. In any case, that was point number one. Point number two is that the institution of tenure has horribly backfired. What is the purpose of tenure? What is the problem that tenure is meant to solve? The problem that tenure is meant to solve is this. So long as people are producing work simply for the purpose of making money, so long as they are writing not for the sake of writing, not for the sake of speaking the truth, but for the sake of having a meal and being able to pay rent, so long as they are doing that, it is thought, they are not going to produce good work. Or if they do produce good work, it'll be very narrow work. It will not be work that really moves the ball forward. It will be too closely hewed to some immediate pressing concern. It will have no real scope, or it just might be outright falsification, or it might just be the sort of rubbish that media executives need you to produce so that they have an award-winning or otherwise acclaimed show. Okay, that's the idea. And so the idea is that, well, when tenure exists, then these thinkers and writers and so on and so forth don't have to dance for their supper, and they can speculate and theorize to their heart's content, and they're not limited by these immediate pressing financial concerns. They can have big ideas. They don't have to have narrow, small, purely practical ideas. That's the idea. Let me explain the reality of the situation. So the reality of the situation is this. In order to get tenure, you have to submit to a few other human beings, okay? So you're not submitting to market forces. That is true. You have been completely, once you get your PhD, once you are on the PhD track, and then once you have your PhD, and then once you're an assistant professor, you are totally insulated from market forces. At that point, it's all about social forces. Now, it's true that the little university bubble within which you're operating is ultimately answerable to economic realities, but the operative word there is ultimately. I mean, you are, for all intents and purposes, completely insulated from such realities. Okay, so what happens is that the economic forces to which the person operating outside the university has to be responsive have been replaced by purely social forces. And the social forces are those basically generated by the petty narcissisms of a few other people, 2 or 3 other people usually. And what happens is that in order to get tenures, you simply have to placate these people and a few other people of their ilk. And you have to write things that please them. You have to write things that are bad, simply bad. Okay? The badness of the work that is done in order to get tenure is cloaked in many ways, but badness is badness is badness, and that's the end of it. Now, you might think, and this is important, you might think, okay, well, in order to get tenure, one has to jump through hoops and one has to reduce oneself, at least temporarily, but then once a given person gets tenure, then he can really let his hair down and theorize away. It never, ever, ever works like that. I have not on one single occasion seen anyone do anything after tenure that they did not do before tenure. What happens after people get tenure is they simply do the same sort of thing that they did before tenure, but they do it in an even more mediocre way than they did it before tenure. I have absolutely never seen somebody pretend to toe a certain line in order to get tenure and then and then do a 180, or do any kind of a shift of any kind. Quite the opposite. Now, there are two explanations, and both explanations are correct. Okay, one explanation is that getting tenure is a very, 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 very involved process. Getting a PhD is a very involved process. Some disciplines are easier than others to get a PhD in, but even if it's a so-called soft PhD, it's still an enormously involved process. It may not require a juggernaut intellect, but it's going to require an enormous amount of work. It's a little bit like becoming an army colonel. Okay, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to become a colonel, but you really have to jump through a very long and otherwise pretty significant series of hoops. And okay, so the one explanation is that by the time you actually do get tenure, you have been completely reconstituted. So it doesn't matter if at age 19 or whatever you were a genius or proto-genius or whatnot. By the time you actually get tenure, supposing that you do get tenure, you have you've been transformed into something that is, far from being the genius that you could have been. Okay, that's explanation number one. So the first explanation is that you've just been reconfigured. That's what you have to do in order to get tenure. The other explanation, which I think ultimately has more legitimacy, is that people who really, really are geniuses, people who really do have something to say, and that's what I mean. That's what I mean by a genius in this context. People who really have something to say. Okay, people who are more than people who are not just kind of recycling old data. People who really are thinkers. People who are not just kind of displaced B-rate tax attorneys. Okay, people who really do have something to say are simply not going to be welcome in a static context, in a context that is governed by petty egotism and is otherwise completely non-dynamic, such as the academic world is. Let me tidy that little statement up a little bit. Okay, so university departments and academic fields, maybe chemical engineering is a little different, but give or take a few obvious qualifications, academic disciplines and university departments are incredibly static. They are unbelievably non-dynamic. They are utterly, unfathomably, infinitely unpredictable. The life of your average secretary is far more tumultuous and dynamic and fraught with unpredictability and uncertainty than is the life of a professor. There is no life with, a few really insignificant classes of exceptions, but there is no life that is as predictable and certain and safe as is the life of a professor. And so to that extent, professors are not really subject to external forces, but they are subject to other people's egos. Those are the only forces to which they are subject. Now, here's the problem, which is that when you are dealing with market forces, there are many ways to respond to market forces. One can respond to them by selling out. One can respond by half selling out. One can respond by doing work that is good, but that is of very limited scope. One can respond by doing work that has considerable scope and is good. There are many ways one can respond, but one way to respond, and it's not an oppositional response, it's a cooperative response. One way to respond to market forces is by drawing from them. It is by soaking up the energy within them and converting it into a product that feeds back into the market in a symbiotic way, in a restorative and invigorating way. People's egos cannot be responded to in that way. If somebody who has power over you, somebody whose driving force in life is his own insecurity and his own compensatory, inflated view of his self-hating self, that sort of energy cannot be reacted to, responded to creatively. That's a purely negative force. It is a purely deadening force. And that is the only force to which the graduate student, to which the pre-tenure professor, and to which the tenured professor respond. Otherwise, that person, the scholar, is in a vacuum. So he is in a hard vacuum with the qualification that the one force to which he is subject is somebody else's all-draining, all-consuming, all-depleting insecurity. In any case, tenure is supposed to promote intellectual freedom, and it is the death of intellectual freedom. And it does the exact opposite of what it is supposed to do, and other arrangements have to be made. They cannot obviously be made through the medium of educational policy for reasons that are not really worth stating in this context. The way to make those changes is to create new online educational institutions that are intermediate between pure businesses on the one hand and universities as we currently know them on the other. And I will discuss this in a later podcast. In my next podcast, I will discuss the third of the three previously mentioned ideas.